We are talking today about a man who says he has contact from out of this world on the Place for History with Katie Seal of the State Historical Society of Missouri. Tell me a little bit about this man from the Ozarks, Buck Nelson.
Yeah, so he's a very, very interesting story. He's actually born out west, kind of moves around a lot, finds work, during the Great Depression era, ends up in California at one point. But by the late 1940s, he's made it here to the Ozarks. So by 1950 census, we can see him there. He's right on the border between Texas County and Howell County. So pretty rural. He's got some land down there. Like any good Ozarker, he builds his own house there on his land. He's got some animals out there that he raises, does gardening. It's pretty self-sufficient. And it's just kind of your average guy, really, at this point. Things don't start getting interesting, I would say, until 1954, when, according to Buck, he has his first encounter. I forget there's the encounters of the first kind or third kind. I think he has all the different kinds of encounters that there are available. But the first encounter he actually kind of goes on to describe as so he's in his house, and like the radio starts going wild, animals outside are kicking up a fuss, and he goes out and he sees this disc-like object in the sky that actually ends up hitting him with some sort of a ray that cures him of a few ailments, some neuritis, some poor vision that he'd been suffering from. And he's just, what's going on? He's, running back inside, trying to get a camera, and actually, gets a photograph of what he says is this disc-like object. He actually tries to kind of like wave, communicate, tell him to come on down, but gets dismissed, and they take off. So it's, I believe, another year and a half before his visitors return. And kind of during this time, he's engaging, trying to understand what it was he saw. He's reaching out, he's actually contacting and making connections with other UFO sighters and believers across the country. So when they come back after that, he actually sees the saucers again, and they kind of circle around his farm, and he's, trying to wave them down, indicate that they can go ahead and land, but they take off for a second time. And it's not until the third round that they actually do land. And according to Buck, 3 crew members emerge and come into his house, and they, sit around and talk, and he gets to learn about these 3 individuals from the spacecraft.
So why him? Why in the Ozarks? Why Buck? Why did they choose him, according to Buck?
So Buck never goes into much detail as to, why him in the first place. He kind of speculates that because he was, obviously trying to, flag them down, telling them that it was okay, that maybe that's why they kept circling back and trying to see him. But then after that third visit, where he actually sits and talks with these 3 individuals, it's at that point that they kind of offer, extend the invitation to go on a journey with them the next time they come, simply because of the conversation that they had with him. He was open to what they had to say, to what they were talking about. There's also the fact that these visitors, I believe at least 2 of them were supposed to be expats of Earth, and who were now on colonies on other planets. So after that first visit, then I believe it's in about 1955. So we're, well over a year later, that he actually goes on board and goes and takes this trip around to Mars and to Venus and to the moon, where there are colonies of other individuals, including ex-Earth living people who are actually living on some of these colonies, and just learning about their way of life, and how they're going about this. And he actually takes all of the knowledge that they give him, and some of it is just very much how to live, kind of. There's a bit of a reminiscence of, I would say, like the Ten Commandments, of treating others well, but it goes further as far as sustainable agricultural practices and lowering pollution and caring for the earth in total, and lowering carbon emissions. So it was kind of like this whole very detailed aspect of just how to properly care for the earth and everybody living on the earth. And the premise was, if he came on the trip with them, he then had to come back and share this knowledge. So he ends up writing his book, My Trip to Mars, the Moon, and Venus, where he details his adventure. He talks about these individuals that he encounters, of the different settlements on these planets and the moon that he visits. His dog actually goes with him on one of these trips. So it's not just him that is now a space explorer. His dog is also along the ride with him. So yeah, he publishes this in 1956, and actually, he sells quite a few copies. And it's during this time that he's actually not only putting himself out there as a kind of a guest speaker, but he's also invited to a lot of locations around the United States of other either groups or individuals wanting him to come talk about his experience and share, kind of what he learned through his trip. And he travels in the late 50s doing kind of this guest lecture series all across. He's interviewed by, newspapers from, kind of all across the nation and stuff, just sharing his and his dog's story.
So this is before we've landed on the moon. So we know now there are not colonies on the moon or Venus, right, or Mars. But he's able to gather a following based on his conversations. And before we go into his following, some of the more interesting parts of those conversations seem to focus on not just agriculture, but you touched on the Bible and the Ten Commandments. Is that what he brings back from his journey?
Yeah, so he brings some of that back, and it shows up in his book, and then it also will show up later in kind of how so he does end up having a spacecraft convention, as one would, but in the speakers he brings in, and kind of the way that actually is brought in. And a lot of it is just kind of back to the, treat your neighbor as yourself, and, love your neighbor, kind of putting in the golden rules that you find in the Bible as well. So he really never got political with anything. It was just very much like, here's how we're supposed to take care of the earth and treat each other, which, the fact that it was, kind of a very open and, I guess, positive spin on thing, I think is kind of what opened it up to a lot of people. It's like, you can't say that, treating your neighbor kindly is wrong, right? So
right. So this wasn't a message, look out, aliens are here. It's not War of the Worlds at all. It's more, let us share your knowledge, our knowledge.
Yeah, it's a much more positive, benevolent. One of the individuals that he actually, encounters on this spacecraft was, someone who formerly lived on Earth, was actually over 200 years old at this point, long life, had obviously lived a while, learned a lot, was just trying to share this knowledge and help others, this is his former planet, just trying to give back to his community, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah. So people start to come to him. So his rise to fame isn't something that happens overnight. This is built over time.
Yeah, probably because he has the first encounter in 1954. And really that's when he starts kind of his letter writing campaign of talking to other individuals. The book comes out in 56. And this is where you got a lot of really great pictures because he answered letters from people all over, you know, sharing his information. He wrote letters to anybody he thought should know this information. And then in 1958, he actually takes this a step further and hosts his own spacecraft convention at his farm. So now he's inviting people out to rural Texas County, to his farm to hear speakers. So it's himself. The first year is a little bit smaller. He doesn't get quite as many people showing up, but he gets probably over 300 people, according to Buck, just for this very first year. And again, you know, this is before the time of internet or social media where you can share. So he's literally just writing letters. Things are going into maybe local newspapers of other groups around the country. So he actually gets people from out of state. And so about 300 people show up the first year. And then the second year, 1959, is what he claims to have been probably his best year, where he had probably over 2,000 people at his farm. And it kind of explodes. You know, it starts out real small where you just had, you know, him sharing his experience, a couple other people talking. And then it was more, I guess, kind of like mingling. People could sit around and talk about their experience, ask questions, that sort of thing. But then in later years, it just starts building and it becomes an almost carnival / revival. There's singers, there's booths of people selling items. I think a few years there were even some carnival kind of rides out there. He cleared some of his land out so people could actually camp there because it ends up being a 2-3 day weekend depending on the year. So people are able to, you know, camp and stick around, listen to the speakers that are coming in from across the country, sit around, gather and talk. There's food, there's music. Yeah.
So the zenith of this, it sounds like, you know, you could buy things. What kind of things could you buy there? His book, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
What are the and food, I'm guessing?
Yeah, so there were food vendors. So you actually had some local people showing up and putting up a food booth, or you had kind of some vendors. Most of it seems to have been kind of trinkets, souvenirs type of things, but there were other people who had, you know, similar experiences to Buck, who had written their accounts. So you had the authors there to sign books and sell them. They also had souvenir booklets that Buck published just about every year of the convention. And what's really interesting is, like, he kind of details a little bit of there's some of the speeches from former years, there's photographs, there's a lovely map. So we can't just blame, you know, current GPS, but he actually had to put in a map of how to get to his farm, because he's so rural and down a back road in the Ozarks. So, you know, just trying to help people out on finding where he's located. So yeah, just a little bit of everything, whoever happened to show up that year.
Did the aliens look like people? Obviously, the former Earthlings look like people, but what about the aliens? Did he describe that?
So everyone he encountered was human. Yeah, looked like humans. They were just had colonies on other planets. I think there was some speculation by others who attended that, you know, maybe there were other life forms from other planets that looked different, but his were all humanoid.
And the spacecraft looked like the one in the booklet you just showed me.
Yes. So he had kind of the very classic disc shape of a saucer. It's about the ones that he saw and described looked like that.
Wow. So how long does this go on? So this starts in 54, I believe you said. Does this last up until the moon landing?
So he has his encounter in 54, starts the convention in 58, and then I believe the last convention that I'm able to track down was in 1966, is when he had it out at his property. And then at that time, his health really is kind of failing. And then also the attendance is just down. So the '66 convention that he had out at his farm. He only had about 50 people, but they were from like 14 different states. So I definitely think with the space race and the moon landing, you start having kind of the falling out and trickling down of fewer and fewer people attending. And then, you know, Buck's getting up in years at this point and is not in good health. So by 1969, he's actually living in Mountain View, in a care facility, just due to poor health. So some of it was a combination of his health, but then also just the lack of people coming out to the convention anymore.
So what happens to the farm and to him?
So while Buck is actually in Mountain View because of his health, there's a fire out at his property and the house does burn down. It appears that it was probably an accident. Buck is, you know, hesitant to believe that. Again, he wasn't there. But he eventually ends up moving in the early 70s back out to California, and then his property is sold and a few locals buy his farm. So there's not much left there from what Buck, other than just the land and a few remnants of some of the outbuildings and stuff that he had built for his farm. But yeah, so he goes out to California, and is really quite interesting because for many years it was uncertain as to what had actually happened to Buck. Nobody knew, you know, so there's a lot of speculation running around. But due to, you know, modern technology and a lot of genealogical materials making their way online, is able to track down a death certificate. So he does pass away out in California in the late 70s.
In the late 70s. And that's the end of the Buck story there.
But he's still kind of a bit of a local legend. Actually, in the past couple years, there have been some kind of festivals, a little bit of honoring Buck Nelson and his legacy and his story down in kind of Howell County. So, you know, Buck goes on, but there's still the memory and the stories about him.
Tell me about these modern day festivals.
Yeah, so they're pretty low key, and some of it is just I think maybe, you know, an excuse to get together and have a good time maybe. And Buck's story, because I think one of the really neat things about Buck's story is if you look at any of the local newspaper stories of people who have encountered him, like, it seems like he was just an absolutely great guy, willing to help others. People were very positive about interacting with him. So, you know, I think a lot of individuals that have stories like this get kind of a bad rap of just being off the wall or even crazy. But everyone's like, no, Buck's just a, you know, kind of a nice guy, and he's got friends. There's all sorts of stories about him visiting people locally or around the country, of going to see friends and visit and stuff. But yeah, so kind of a little bit of a grassroots local events down in kind of Howell County. There was kind of during the eclipse, a few people took, you know, advantage of that. And, you know, there's a Buck Nelson Eclipse Festival with some, I think there was a couple different events, like a run and a lighted parade and stuff. Just, you know, anything astrological or space oriented, we're going to circle back to Buck.
So he left a great impression, and people don't walk around going, well, this guy was kind of.
Right. Yeah. You know, there were certainly skeptics. I think that was kind of part of the fun of especially some of the newspaper articles. You could see some, you know, hardcore reporters going down there being like, all right, we're gonna really, you know, open the can of worms here and find out what's going on. And then they come back with this just kind of, you know, like, no, I don't believe his story, but at the same time, he's kind of a great guy. It was a fun event. There was so much going on that, and you know, maybe that was part of the success, is it was, you know, other people that shared Buck's story, or, you know, his belief in spacecrafts. But I think it was also just a fun outing, something to go to, like just a local festival you could go and have fun at too.
Well, Katie, thanks for sharing the story of Buck Nelson and this part of Ozarks history. we'll look forward to sharing another story with you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.